Alright, in this video it's not so much going to be a tutorial, it's just going to kind of be a way of thinking in terms of how I optimize my scenes for rendering. Alright, and I'm by no stretch of the imagination trying to claim this is the best way or the only way. I'm sure there are better ways to do this, but this is how I've learned to do it, and it's worked pretty good for me, and I've always seemed to get halfway decent results and halfway decent render times by doing it this way. And keep in mind, I generally do not create one-off renders, meaning the stuff I do are animations. So optimizing how long it takes, or optimizing the scene so it takes a lower amount of render time is more important when it comes to animations, especially when you're not doing it professionally like I am, because I don't do anything like this professionally. It's just a hobby for me. Alright, now my goal is to get a halfway decent render out of this with maybe 64 to 128 samples. And this is an interior scene. This interior scene, let me get out of camera view. It's, well, let me select that so I can actually orbit around it. It's literally just a box, and it has a hole in the side for a window. And if you look inside, I have one light source right here, which is a sconce or light attached to the wall. Alright, so interior scenes are notoriously noisy. So here's how I go about trying to minimize noise, maximize the output quality for a low amount of samples and render time. Alright, first thing I do, I kind of always sort of have this idea. I want to be able to do stuff between 64 and 128 samples. Obviously, that's not always possible. So, first thing I essentially do, I go ahead and turn off any denoiser, because I don't want that messing up the information I'm getting from the things that I'm getting ready to do. Over here in the render tab, I come down here to the light paths. First thing I'm going to do, obviously, is just set this to 64. I think that's the lowest I could possibly go. So I'm going to set this to 64. And that's mostly, at this point, just so my renders come out quicker and I can get results quicker. Alright, I come down here to the light paths, and I go ahead and set everything to 0, set this to 32. Now, you could set this to pretty much any number, but that's just the total number of bounces altogether that it will allow. I set it to 32 because I've never seen, except for very rare cases where you have a lot of glass and you have light having to go through a tons of glass or something like that, that I've needed to go over 32. So 32 is generally what I start with. Something like this, 32 for sure would be fine. Have everything else set to 0. I go ahead and turn off light clamping, or basically set it to 0. Go ahead and turn off reflective and refractive. Now, you will turn these on later, but this is just to get an idea of what's going on. And also I want to explain some of these settings, what they do, and provide examples. Alright, and under performance for this scene, because there's no moving parts, I will go ahead and turn on persistent data. That way each render will take less time, because it doesn't have to rebuild the scene for each render. It's already built essentially, and it just has to transfer the data into the GPU instead of rebuild it and then send it to the GPU. Alright, with these settings, this will not look good at all, but that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and click render. And that right there looks a lot like a rasterized scene. You have a little bit of light spill at the top. You have light around this light on the wall, on the back of the chair. And the reason why it looks so bad is because there is no light bounce whatsoever. You can't see any reflection of the light on this glass that's on this poster. And like the light that's shining on this wall, it's not reflecting off this wall onto anything else. The light is going from whatever light source, from this or from the sun outside, shining through a window and hitting whatever it hits, and that's it. Nothing more, nothing else, nothing less. Although there is a little bit of diffused light, like scattered rays, I guess you could say, that are hitting up here and in other locations. But there's no real light bounces. Alright, now I'm going to switch this over to slot 2. And I'm going to change the diffuse to 1. Render image. Alright, now I'm going to change this to 3. And this right here is mostly as an example. But there is a point behind it. And I don't do this every time because, quite frankly, I've figured out about where this needs to be. But I'm just going through methodically here so I can give you an example of what this looks like. And we could swap between them. And we can see where this threshold of where adding more light bounces actually does not help. Because if you go past that point, then you're just going to make it take longer to render, and you're not going to get much better quality out of it, if any better quality. Alright, now this is probably enough. Make this the last one, and just in case you didn't know, you can press the letter J on your keyboard and you can swap between these slots just by pressing the letter J. Alright, this is slot 1. This is no bounces. If I press J and go to slot 2, this is 1 bounce. 1 diffuse bounce. This is 2 diffuse bounce. Now 2 to 3, it made a slight difference, but 3 to 4 made no difference. So this tells me that this scene right here, 3 bounces is all we need. Now I'm going to write that down. That way we don't forget. 3 diffuse. Alright. Now I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 0. And then set this back to slot 1. And I'm going to do the same thing with the glossy. Now I'm actually going to set it to slot 2 because we already know what it looks like on 0. So I'm going to put this on 1. And then click render image. Now see what changed? All of a sudden you have a reflection on the floor now. The floor is kind of glossy. The poster up here, this little edge right here has a little bit of gloss to it. All of it basically has gloss. The ceiling has some gloss, so you have some reflections now. Alright, now I'm going to set it to slot 3. And then turn the glossy up one more time. Render image. And again, you wouldn't do this every time. Eventually you're going to figure out about where it needs to be, and then you're just going to fine tune it a little bit. Alright. I'm going to go turn this up one more, change this to slot 4, and then click render image. Alright, going to change this to 4 bounces on the glossy, change this to slot 5, and then render image. And I'm going to do it one more time. Change this to 5 bounces, slot 6, render image. Alright, now I'm going to go back to slot 1 and watch how the reflections change. I'll press J to flip through the renders. No bounces, 1 glossy bounce, 2 Glossy Bounce, 3. So, you didn't see any difference. Alright, no glossy. 1, you see a big, huge difference. 2 bounces, you see a little bit difference. But when you go to 3 bounces, you don't see any change. So we know this scene essentially only needs 2 glossy bounces. So I'm going to bring this up, set this to 2, and glossy. Alright. Now, we do have transmission in this scene. And a transmission is essentially if it's going through something that's, if light is going through something that's somewhat transparent or mostly transparent, like glass. Alright. Now, I do have glass in this scene, which is this picture frame right here. So now I'm going to go back to slot 1. Actually, I'm going to go to slot 2 because we already know what no bounces look like. So I'm going to set this to 1. And I'm in slot 2. I'm going to click render. And see how much brighter this looks now because the light's actually being able to go through the glass like it should. Or to an extent. Alright. Change this to slot 3. And then set this to 2 transmission bounces. Render image. Not much change, but I'm going to go 1 more just to be sure. Alright, now I'm going to set this back to slot 1, and then I'm going to scroll through it. No transmission bounces. 1 transmission bounces. 2, I didn't see no change. 3, I didn't see no change. So in this scene, all I need is 1 transmission bounce. So that's 1 trans. Alright. I'll slide this over here. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up. 3 for the diffuse, 2 for the glossy, and 1 for the transmission. I don't have any volumetrics here, so I know I can keep the volume set to 0. I don't have any transparency, so I can set that to 0. So this scene will have a maximum of 3, 2, 6 light bounces. Regardless of where this is set at, there's only going to be 6 light bounces because that's what these add up to at the most. Now, it could possibly use less than that if Blender decided it didn't need it, but or at least that's my understanding, but for all intents and purposes it's going to be 6 light bounces total. Now with this set, if I was to click render image, it should look somewhat decent, although noisy. But I mean, we're talking 64 samples at this point. Alright. Another thing that makes reflections, especially when it comes to glass and caustics, of course there ain't going to be no caustics in this scene, but just reflections in general, is to turn on reflective and refractive caustics. Now, it won't make a big difference in this scene. Like, let me go ahead and change to slot 5, and then I'll re-render it. It may not make any difference at all. Alright, let me go back to 4. Oh, it did make a little bit of a difference. Yeah, made everything just a little bit brighter, I guess because some of the light is just bouncing a little bit better. And it didn't take any extra time to have that turned on, so leave it on. Alright, now direct light clamping and indirect light clamping. My rule of thumb for interior scenes, I set this to, let's say, 15 on the direct and 10 on the indirect. Now sometimes I will go through and change this a little bit, but for the most part, this is what I keep it at. And even on outdoor scenes, for the most part, this works. And if I think I understand what this does, I know setting this will help reduce fireflies. And from my understanding, this right here basically clamps or limits the brightness of a pixel. I don't understand what the relationship between 15 and a perception of brightness is, but basically, if I set this higher, it will allow a pixel in this image that has direct light shining on it to be brighter. Now, if I set this to 15, it seems to work. And this right here is the same thing, except this is indirect lighting. This would be like light that hits this wall and then reflects off somewhere else. So usually around 10 seems to work. I mean, but that's something you'd have to experiment with. It's kind of different for every scene, but for the most part, it's around 15 and 10 in my opinion. But I'm sure someone who understands this part better than me could explain it way, way, way better. Alright. So now, we have that set, and I'm going to go ahead and change this to slot 6, and I'm going to click render one more time. Alright, now let's see if there's any difference that we can actually see. Very tiny, tiny difference. The difference that I see mostly is in some of these speckles down here in this shadow area. Some of the speckles are a little bit brighter without this clamped than with it clamped. That's pretty much the only difference I'm seeing. But this is a very simple scene. Alright. Now, we are pretty much ready to turn on some kind of denoiser. And originally, I was promoting, or not really promoting, but I was using optics. But I've gotten more used to open image denoiser, and I actually think it's better than optics. So, yeah, that's what I would recommend using. And I'm not 100% sure if I could explain albedo and normal, how that affects the denoiser, but in general, it looks better if I have albedo and normal turned on with open image denoiser. Now with optics, it generally looks better if I have it set to none. I don't know why, that's just how it seems to be to me. And of course, I always set this to accurate. I'd rather wait an extra quarter of a second or half second, and the result be better, you know. So I just keep it set to accurate. Alright, now I'm going to set this to slot 7. And the only thing I turned on was the denoiser. Render image. Now the denoising pass should... Alright, it's a little noisy. It's got a lot of artifacting, I guess you could say noisy artifacting, because it lost a lot of details in the denoiser. But we're actually pretty close, although it definitely needs more passes. Now, at this point, what I will probably do, typically speaking, I will take this number and I will, well, let me get more organized here. Let me go back to slot 1, and I'm going to render it one more time. And I'm just doing this to kind of keep my thoughts organized. That way I can kind of scroll through them and see what the difference is. At this point, I will probably go to slot 2, and I will simply multiply this number by 10. make it 640 passes. Because the idea is to get, as few samples as possible and still have a decent image. So my line of thinking at this point is, if 64 samples was, okay but not good, if I multiply it by 10, then I will get a fairly decent result. And if it turns out that 640 samples is a good result, then I know my what I'm shooting for is going to be between 64 and 640. It's kind of a rudimentary way of thinking about it, I guess you could say. And it's not the most efficient way to do it by no stretch of the imagination. None of this is the most efficient way that I could imagine. Alright, see, now this worked out pretty good. Not too bad, in my opinion. Alright, took 41 seconds, 640 samples on the interior scene, and I'm using a 3080 Ti. So keep that in mind. It's a pretty powerful GPU. So, if you was using like a 2060 Super, this would be 3.5 minutes, something like that, maybe 3 minutes to get this same result. Alright. Now that doesn't look bad. I'm going to change this to slot 3, and then I'm going to cut this in half, 320, and we'll see what this looks like. Alright, 320. Let me swap between. Alright, that's 640 samples, and that's 320. You can definitely see a difference, which means if you're okay with these results, stick with it. But I can tell you right now, the number of samples I need is higher than 320 for this scene. So I will go pretty much right in the middle between 320 and 640, and that's what, 160, 180, 480, 480, and let me change this to slot 4. I think this right here will be it as far as what I would use for this scene. And it looks like it's going to be about 30 seconds is how long it's going to take to render. And generally, whenever I do animations in Blender, I try to keep all my renders for each frame below 30 seconds. And that's because sometimes I render, thousands of frames. Alright, now let's compare this to 640 samples, which is slot 2. There is a difference, but it's minimal. Alright, so that's probably what I would use for this scene. 480 samples. Alright, I think that's pretty much my explanation of this. If you have any questions, let me know. Now, just for fun, and just because I have this kind of time right at this moment, I'm going to turn off Denoiser. I'm going to set this to slot 5, and instead of 480 samples, I'm going to set this to 10,000 samples. And of course, I'm going to fast forward through this. And my idea here is I want to compare the results of this 10,000 samples to the results of 480 samples, but with Denoiser. Now I can tell you for sure which one is going to look better. It's almost certainly going to be the 10,000 sample one. But 10,000 samples is probably going to take way too long. Of course, you know, I made a mistake here. And I don't know how I managed to do this. I'm canceling this because I need to go back and point out some glaring mistake that I made. I forgot to turn on noise threshold. You know, the default on the noise threshold is 0.01. 0.01 is fine for the most part. Now if I was to set this to 480, and I'm going to go ahead and change this to slot 1, and let me go ahead and turn Denoiser back on, render image. Now it took 31 seconds before. It should probably drop to 29 seconds just by turning that on. Didn't make much difference at all. It actually took longer, which surprises me, because it took 31 seconds without this turned on, and it took 37 seconds with it turned on. So yeah, that right there actually surprised me. So sometimes it doesn't do any good to have this noise threshold turned on. So yeah, that's interesting. Alright, now I'll change this back to 10,000. Turn off Denoiser, and I'll change this to slot 2. Render image, and of course we're fast forwarding through this so that we can get the results much quicker. But like I was saying before, I think the results on this 10,000 will look way better than 480 samples with Denoise. Now this is when it comes to a trade-off. Are you trying to render an animation? If you're trying to render an animation, then maybe, yeah, you want to use Denoiser, especially if you want to get it done quickly, and it's not a professional job. If it's a professional job that you're getting paid for, then obviously, yeah, you're going to want to minimize the use of any Denoiser and maximize the use of samples, because you want, in professional work, you generally want quality over time. When the stuff I do, where I just post stuff to YouTube, I generally want to maximize the amount of output compared to the time it takes rendering and so forth. And you can already see how much better this image is looking right now with basically 2,000 or 2,250 samples. And I would venture the guess that if you're doing this for, you know, something professional, you could probably get by with 2,500 samples and then use Denoiser, because the more detail that's in it, the more samples you render it at, the more actual details emerge, and the less the Denoiser will actually get rid of or squash out some of the details. Probably the Denoiser at this point would actually make it look decent. But I'm going to go ahead and let it go on up to 10,000 samples just for fun. Got about 6 minutes left. Alright, it just finished. 10,000 samples. Took 9 minutes and 34 seconds, which is not bad for 10,000 samples on an interior scene. 3080 Ti is a nice card. Alright, now let's see what it looks like and compare it to This was 480 samples with Denoiser. Look how much fewer details are in this because of the Denoiser versus the 10,000 samples without Denoiser. Now, realistically, as I was watching this render, you could probably set this to 2,500 samples and use Denoiser, and you would come out with a better image than this. It would be less noisy, even though there's not much noise in this, but if you zoom in, you can see that there's some noise, especially like if you go into a shadow area like right here, you can see quite a bit of noise. If you was to set that to 2,500 samples and then turn Denoiser on, you would have better results probably, and you wouldn't lose any detail for the most part that I would imagine you wouldn't lose any details. Alright, well, I think that's it at this point. My neighbor actually is outside wanting to cut grass, so I'm got to go deal with that, and I guess that's it. If you have any questions about this, because I know I kind of glossed over a whole bunch of stuff and I may not have explained myself very well, but generally speaking, you know, limit the number of light bounces to the minimum you need, and your renders will be quicker. You, generally speaking, if you use a noise threshold setting of 0.01 or even 0, generally your renders will be quicker. Now, on interior scenes, it doesn't make a huge difference, and as you can see in this case, using noise threshold made it actually take longer. So that's just a rule of thumb. But I guess that's it. Later, people.